Does it actually pay off to buy heifers, breed them, and sell them as breds or pairs? Let's find out. Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Today we are visiting with Jon Biermacher, and we are going to talk about the economics behind buying weaned heifer calves, adding value to them through a breeding program, and selling them as either long-breds or as pairs. And so Jon's going to walk through the different economic models that he has been working on, some different considerations that he has put into there, like whether you use artificial insemination or natural service, etc., along with a lot of other factors. And we're going to figure out where the profit lies, if at all. Remember to leave a rating or review and really hit subscribe on whichever podcast platform you are listening on. Those rating or reviews, they're not just for show. They help more people find this podcast. And when you guys reach out and message me with some comments, thoughts, questions, suggestions, that helps me improve the show for you. So please be sure to do that. It means more to me than you realize. But with that, let's visit with Jon about the economics behind heifer development. All right, Jon. Well, like I said before I hit that red record button, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. If you're a longtime listener or even just a listener that joined us in the past year, you know that this is Jon's second time on the show. He previously joined me for a conversation about what the most profitable options are for managing open cows and cull cows. So, Jon, welcome back.
Well, thanks, Shaye. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, Jon, today you've been doing some work, some economic models around heifer development, and we're going to discuss that. But do you want to remind listeners a little bit about your role in the beef industry today and how you work with producers or help producers?
Sure. So, again, I'm at North Dakota State University. I'm in our Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics. I was hired almost 4 years ago. I came up from Oklahoma, where I previously worked at the Noble Research Institute. And I was hired as a livestock development specialist in the extension program. I do have a 20% research appointment, but quite a lot of that position was focused around trying to figure out ways to help increase, grow, and develop livestock enterprises in the state. Specifically, they were very interested in livestock enterprises that would consume soybean meal. So a lot of my stakeholders are actually corn and soybean growers, and specifically the Soybean Growers Association. They have a lot of meal now. And so a lot of that work's been focused not as much on beef cattle, but earlier on it was focused more on swine and dairy, because swine and dairy tend to eat more soybean meal than most of our beef cattle enterprises for the state. Since then, I've motivated myself to get back over into beef cattle more, so I've been doing quite a bit of economic work around different questions and aspects of the beef cattle sector here in North Dakota. And so, so it's all livestock. And so we've done feasibility work with swine. Dairy, we're getting some attraction to get some large dairies that have made it through the permitting process and seem to be on a green light to start building end of the year, beginning of next year. So that's good. Swine, we've got a few projects. Swine's a little bit different kind of enterprise when it comes to public perception, but there are some swine growers down in, sort of the Oaks area and some other places, and there's a couple new projects for some farrowing and breeding operations. But so I'm kind of on the spectrum of all livestock, but I'm getting more questions on beef cattle. Imagine that, right? Because we're in a beef cattle state. We're almost at 950 1,000 beef cows now, almost back up to 1 million, so that's good. I think we're the 9th or 10th largest beef cattle state in the country, and so we have a lot more beef cattle producers, and I'm getting more questions. And some of those questions have been revolving around heifer development. And by heifer development, I really mean not heifers that are produced on the farm, but people who are interested in actually going out and buying weaned heifers or wintered heifers that have been backgrounded, adding, breeding programs to them, and then either marketing pairs or bred heifers. And so what we're going to talk about today is some of the work that I've been doing in that area specifically.
Awesome. Well, you already kind of answered my next question, which was, a little more clarification on what you meant by heifer development. So thank you for highlighting that this isn't necessarily focused on raising your own heifers. Like you said, it's if you go purchase heifers and you want to add to them through a breeding program, per se, as an example. Do you want to share a little bit more about the background of that research and what that has looked like up to this point?
It's kind of an interesting project in that in this particular case, we actually had a very young producer. He's actually now a former student in our ag technology program here at NDSU. And about, a year and a half ago, back in the winter, a year and a half ago, he got a hold of Tim Petrie and myself and wanted to come by and ask us some questions about this idea he had. And he actually comes from a pretty good-sized farm and ranch family that's up in northwestern Minnesota, up in Greenbush area. And his name's Gavin Eag, and his family runs the Eag Cattle Company, and they have pretty good-sized operation up there. And he's going back and has now since gone back to the farm, and he's predominantly working on the grain side of it with the farming part of it, but he very much wants to get his own little beef cattle enterprise going. And so he came and talked to Tim and I, and he asked us what we thought about the economics of kind of going and buying some of these kind of wintered, backgrounded 750-pound sort of heifers and breeding them up, and then marketing kind of a year later, kind of marketing either bred heifers or pairs or some combination. And he brought with him kind of a sketched out enterprise budget, and which I thought, well, good for him, right? He's really trying to put the numbers and trying to think it through. And we sat and thought about it and chatted with him. And I kind of took his original budget and I went through and I said, well, he's got a lot of the key things, but there's some things he's missing. Usually we don't always want to include all the costs. And in his case, it's not that he wasn't trying to include the cost. In his case, in his mind, he was sort of perceiving those costs as non-existent because he was kind of going to use some of it kind of from farm overhead from the family farm. And I said, well, I can appreciate that. I said, but I still think it's probably good if we calculate like the cost, all the expenses associated with this particular enterprise. So at least, even if you're getting some of the land from your family, you at least know what that's costing. Or, like you're using some equipment, we ought to at least know what it's costing for just this enterprise. So he kind of helped me and he kind of became a partner, and we put together kind of a detailed enterprise budget. And then I got to thinking, well, and Tim and I would talk, and it's like, well, there are others who actually do this enterprise and have for years. And so we thought this would probably be good to have as a decision tool that producers could use. And so that's something NDSU has a history of doing. And so we've taken it a little bit further, and we've kind of got it set up where, producers can go in. It's basically an Excel workbook that has multiple sheets, but one sheet basically just has basically a handful of information that we would want to get from producers. But NDSU also puts in our projections. So, for example, we need to know, like, how many heifers do you want to buy? Like, how big is this enterprise? Gavin himself, he was thinking about 20 to 30 head. I developed the tool for basically 100 head, but it's set up to where you can put in whatever. You could put 1,000 if you wanted to. And then, we need certain things. So we need prices. We need cattle price. How much are you going to pay? What's your expectation for what you're going to pay for the heifers? What are you going to be able to sell pairs for? What's your projections for selling bred heifers? We budget in some opens. You always have a few opens. And then, of course, you've got pasture to feed and hay. You know, like he was saying, he's going to utilize a little bit of a tractor to feed, you know, hay and feed and things like that. And, of course, you have veterinarian health for these animals. You have a breeding program. That's interesting because we model 2 breeding programs. We modeled artificial insemination because that's pretty common when it comes to heifer development, whether it's on the farm or whether you're purchasing and reselling. But we also modeled it without that. So with just a bull battery versus AI program plus cleanup bulls, which is pretty common. And the economics do matter, but we have options for both. We have some transportation, you know, you got to go buy them and bring them, and if you're going to go take them back to market to sell them. So we do have some of that in there, interest, marketing cost. And so we kind of have a very detailed budget. All the calculations are over in the other sheets for all the different categories. But basically, for the producer, they can go and look and see what our projections, like Tim and I put in projections for what we think, and we're thinking like April, May, we're gonna buy these 750-pound heifers, and a year later, we would have either bred heifers to sell, or we could calve them out and have pairs. And then we would have a handful of opens that we would sell. Yeah, and so producers then can go in and they can look and see what our projections are for these little handful of sort of price and parameters that you have to have for all the calculations. And then if they want to, they have a place where they can go in. For example, if they know they have a better market than what we're projecting. And Tim and I can be pretty conservative on prices. Gavin was a little bit more optimistic when we first did it. So, but he could at least see what our projections, and we do these projections anyway. And so it's kind of a way for them to compare back to the NDSU projections. And they can put in different things like distance to market matters. You know, if you're a long way away, then the transportation costs are a little higher, for example. Mm-hmm. And so you can put in and parameterize your own farm, and then it automatically calculates the expected revenues and the expected cost, and then the difference is sort of the net return. Then they can compare our projected net returns with whatever their projections are based on their kind of idea about what prices and costs are going to be.
You bring up distance to market matters, but then I know a lot of people who are selling bred heifers privately as well. And, you know, or even you look at commission can vary between barn to barn, or market opportunities in general. Are they doing any value added or a part of any special sales? I mean, there's a lot of different factors that can go into that, but it sounds like you guys have pretty much thought about it all, or at least working on getting it all in there.
We have, but your point's well taken, Shaye, in that, from an NDSU standpoint, we're coming up with a projection that people can use as a guideline, because you're right, every ranch is different, and how the access to markets, the markets themselves, some of them are doing, there's some of these ranches now that are doing video auctions they're doing bred heifer sales, or doing calf, they're doing all kinds of sales, just video auction. And so we haven't put in commissions and fees that are associated with the video auction stuff, but we sort of have used averages for sort of sale barn commission fees. So that's a good point. And maybe in my next iteration, I'll try to think of a way to include like video auction or something like that, because that is becoming more popular. But I think when I was doing this, I'm thinking Gavin was just thinking he's gonna go buy them, he's gonna breed them up, and then he's going to go back to a sale. And so that's how we bottled it right now. But everything else, I think, other than sort of marketing, everything else, I think we have covered the bases that would be a true cost for for any producer that's doing this particular kind of enterprise, I think.
So I'm curious, once everything was said and done, how does AIing versus just using a natural service for the full breeding season compare economically? Because that has been a hot conversation with bull prices the last few years as well.
That's a great question. And so just quick and dirty, the economics is about $55 different. And I can tell you it's even more than that if you count labor. And one thing we did not do here is we got a net return to, we do have land in terms of we've got a rental rate for pasture. Mm-hmm. But we did not account for labor. We assume it's a net return to labor management and farm overhead, and which is pretty common in our world. But part of the issue with AI is the number of times you got to run them through to do all the treatments. So you got to sync them up.
So you said it, I'm just going to clarify. You said it was a $55 difference, saying AI was more profitable or less profitable?
It's $55 more profitable to not use AI.
And that was not even counting the labor that went into it?
It is not. It would be probably even more. And so, but I do think we have it set up as a yes or no. You're either going to use it or not, kind of a discrete choice. And most of my animal science colleagues argue that we need to have it. But I'm struggling to find out what the price difference is between whether or not you're using AI. In other words, if I sell a bred heifer that's been AI'd versus not AI'd, I'm having a hard time finding price differences.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I would think about it where that might potentially be made up, because this is hypothetical. But one of the benefits we talk about with AI is if you're AIing to a really good or well-renowned sire, that price difference, and you're selling privately, not necessarily through a barn, there could be that increase there. Again, hypothetically, that's potentially an opportunity.
And that's something maybe over time we can think about how to go and do. But so anyway, we got it both ways. But for Tim and I to figure out how to really get any additional value on the revenue side, I got to have price differentiation. And again, at NDSU, I think our goal is to help whoever that needs help, but I don't necessarily think the private market people need as much help as maybe some of the startups and some of the smaller producers. Kind of like Gavin trying to get into this and try to, see if he can start small and work his way and see if that's just something that helps him get into the cattle business on the side while he's over helping his family farm several thousand acres. And so we probably need to think about how to go about doing that for the private sale people, which could be a little different. Now, I will say this, though. We do assume that you would have good genetics in your breeding bulls, whether you're using AI or non-AI. So if you're buying straws, we're assuming you're getting quality genetics. And if you're only using breeding bulls, we're assuming you're using quality genetics. That's a big assumption, but I think that those people that would want to go down this route would probably tend to agree that they would want to use solid genetics. Otherwise, that's going to come back and bite you later, I think.
I would agree with that as well. And I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I think this is still valuable to those who are selling privately. Yes, it might not, they might not directly be the ones seeking it out, or it might be targeted more towards, like you said, your Gavins. But private people also need a base to work off of and learn from and go from too. So I can still see application across the board there, even though its use is probably going to be different from person to person.
Right. So like one thing we're assuming is, which is a pretty steep assumption, but I think it's valid because we know some people that actually do this, We're assuming $5,000 bulls, and we're buying bulls for 2 months, and then we are selling them back. And so basically, we've got the cost for feeding and hay and feed for bulls and pasture, but we're basically buying bulls, using them 2 months, and getting our money back. Because that's not as uncommon as you might think for this type of an enterprise.
I think about it on the cow-calf side, like you said, but we're not talking about raising our own heifers, so that's different. So that makes a little more sense.
Yeah, and the other thing too is because of the time of the year when we're doing this, we're also, if we are on a cow-calf operation that has a set of breeding bulls, whether they're using AI or not, if they're cleanup bulls or if they're just the natural breeding bulls, that's the time of year when they're actually breeding up the cow herd too. So we don't really have access to rested breeding bulls like we would if maybe we were trying to breed up some cull cows or something at a different time of the year. It's interesting because, as you could probably imagine, 88% of the cost here in this enterprise, right, is heifer purchase is 70%, 68% of the cost. 20% is the pasture, feed, hay, and mineral. So imagine that the price of the animal and pasture and feed are count for the bulk, almost 90%. Breeding accounts for less than 2%. The way we've done it using artificial insemination. It's much less if you just use cleanup bulls. And then the interest on owning the heifer during the year is about 4%, so it's not trivial. I like for all producers to see that interest cost when I do these budgets because it's definitely something. But close to 90% is the heifer purchase and feed and pasture. And so you can imagine that kind of makes sense because those are typically the main cost associated with beef cattle, any kind of livestock operation typically.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Now, Jon, I'm curious, again, from that profit perspective, we talked about AI versus non-AI, but how did selling bred heifers compare to selling pairs?
Yeah, so in our projections, we did these projections that I'm looking at right now back in January 1st of the year for basically selling and buying in April. So Tim and I have a sale price for bred heifers that's just a little bit less than pairs. We're using $4,200 per bred heifer versus $4,300 for a pair. The pairs would do better by $100. Now there's a little bit of an expense from the pair over the bred heifer, and there's a little risk so you're going to keep them and let them breed out, and there could be a little additional feed, not much, because these are long-bred. They're about ready. There is some risk of that because we don't really know, but there is some risk of dystocia or some other issues that you could have if you want to wait and breed them out. But in this particular year, the price of pairs was a little higher. But that may or may not be the case every year. It kind of depends.
So you brought up a good point that we didn't discuss. You said there was only maybe a little increased risk and increased cost because these were long breds. Can you clarify the timeline of this study as far as approximately when heifers were purchased to when they were sold?
Yeah, it's basically 1 year. So basically what we're doing is we're basically assuming we're going to go buy a heifer that was weaned in the fall and was wintered. So I'm just going to say backgrounded. And so we're basically buying a heifer in the spring, like right before green up. So between April and May. It'll be different from every year depending on the weather. And then we're going to keep her for a year, and then the same time, the following years when we're going to be selling her as a replacement for, say, an open. That would be our timeline. So it's kind of think April to April, or say mid-April to mid-April. And of course, if the weather's nice, then you're going to get a quicker green up. It kind of just depends, especially up here, but so that's sort of that time frame, yeah.
Folks, are you ready for more conversations to push your ranch to the next level and keep you thinking about how you can improve as a ranch manager? If you're thinking, heck yeah, then you need to join my free Facebook group, Rising Ranchers, where you can connect and learn from other ranchers and experts, as well as access additional ranching resources. You can find the direct link in the show notes. So, Jon, obviously we've talked about the profit differences, which from a producer standpoint is always that first finding that at least I'm curious about if I'm looking at a new enterprise. But what other findings did you discover that you think are important to highlight?
I think what's interesting about this particular is we're trying to do projections. A lot of that's sort of what we have to do unless we have sort of long-term scientific trials where we have animal scientists that actually conduct these trials, randomized, replicated over time. We kind of have to do projections and base some result on what we think is going to happen. And so in this particular case, it's kind of based, it's the latter. It's kind of based on what our projected cattle prices, feed prices, and those sort of things. And what really matters about this is understanding the break-evens. And so you kind of put together a set of projections for input and output prices and a lot of distance and all the other things that I was saying. Then you have to come back and ask yourself, okay, so you get kind of what I call a base case expected profitability. But how sensitive is that to changes in our assumptions about our projections? And so what I like to do, the way I've got this set up, that you can put in your set of expected prices, and then you can go and say, like, for example, our expected net return when we did this in January for all the best information we had was just at $200. The NDSU projection was at $200 a head. And so it was 191, right? And if you take that out to 100 head, then you can take that out to the size, the total. Gavin's projections were a little more optimistic, and his projections, he was going to do 80% pairs and 20% breds because of the way his prices worked out. And his projection was more like 300 per head, including all the costs that we came up with. And like I said, Tim and I were a little more conservative on the price and for the NDSU projections. So it turned out, though, that Gavin was pretty close. I talked to him, and he actually got prices that were higher than what Tim and I projected. And so he got close to this $300. To me, the thing is, how much of a change in your price would it take before your $300 or Tim and I's $200 for it just to go to zero or go negative? So what I do is after we build our projections, I go in and I calculate the break-even price. What's the most I can afford to pay for a bred heifer, given the prices that I think I'm going to get for selling bred heifers or pairs, right? And then I say, okay, I put the price of the heifer purchase back to where my base is, and I say, okay, what's the least price I can receive for, say, a bred heifer, holding everything else constant, where I still pencil in a profit? So understanding the break-evens, and I think understanding the break-evens are important for absolutely every enterprise. whether it's cow-calf, it's finishing, backgrounding, even processing, right? We want to know break-evens. And so the way this model's been set up, it's very easy for a producer to put in a set of prices they think they're going to get, or they can just use our projections and then go in and I calculate them for our projections to see. And so we use $3.60 a pound to purchase the heifers to begin with, the 750-pound heifers. The model's very sensitive to that price. It's much more sensitive to the purchase price. You always hear you got to buy things right to make any money, right? It's all in, you got to buy your inputs right. And it roughly at $3.80. So a 20-cent difference wipes out our $200. And that's where you have to ask yourself, am I willing to take that risk? 20 cents isn't much. I mean, 20 cents. So can you lock it in? Now, one thing we haven't done that we probably need to do is we don't have any kind of insurance or any kind of risk management. And there are some tools that we could use to lock something in. On the final product side, the results weren't nearly as sensitive as the purchase of the heifer to begin with price. And so I would say, I don't know if it's something I've learned from this, it's just something I know is true, is understand your break-evens. The profit results aren't that sensitive. They're sensitive, but they're not nearly as sensitive to feed, differences in feed prices as they are that heifer price to begin with.
I just appreciate you taking the time to walk through this project that you've been working on and create this resource for producers, because even though a lot of my listeners are in states and countries that are not North Dakota or the United States, it can still be a valuable tool to them and resource to utilize.
The other thing that I've taken away from all this too is, and it's a time issue. We have lots of questions and the time to do it, but another project that we'll do next, we will do, and South Dakota State has one, but Tim and I have been kicking around the idea of creating an actual, the actual heifer development economics for an actual cow-calf operator. The one that South Dakota State has is pretty good, though. So I don't know how redundant that'll be. But part of the problem is when I go look at the calculators, I don't personally think a lot of the producers want to see all the equations. I know a lot of producers and they don't want to see all the calculations. They tend to trust that we understand how to do them, and we appreciate that, but they themselves. But I can't see all the equations in the calculators at South Dakota State, so I don't know exactly what they've done completely. I'm assuming it's probably correct, but...
Well, I think that goes both ways. When I'm plugging something in right away, I want, no matter what it is, I like a simple, clean look. But that doesn't mean later on I wouldn't want to go back and look and see, okay, exactly what was included or not included.
Oh, I agree. And one of the issues that I face and other modelers face is that especially when you use Excel, Excel's great for a lot of things, but it's very difficult to like we want to kind of protect, because if you're not careful, users can go in and before you know it, they've changed to some stuff that you don't want them to change. So you kind of have to protect certain things. But in Excel, you either protect something or you kind of don't. When you protect a sheet that's got a lot of formulas in it, you can't go in there and actually see the formulas. I'm kind of hoping with some of the AI technology that we can kind of circumvent some of that, where we can get some of the AI technology to come in and protect things. So you can't change it, but you can put your cursor on it and you can see the formula up in the formula bar. You know what I'm saying? I know that's probably a little too technical for a lot of our producers, and I wish we had a better way where we can make it to where you can kind of protect them, but also see them. And I haven't figured that out. The other thing too is with AI, I think we can get to the point where we can take these things and these kind of spreadsheet tools. And I don't know how much of a demand there is for this. I think it's not as big as what some think, but I think now it's pretty easy to turn these into like phone calculators. And so I don't know. I wish I had a better handle on how many people wanted this kind of thing, not in a spreadsheet form, but they actually wanted it for their phone. I just really don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But if you're a listener out there, you should reply. You can go to my website and on the Contact Us form, and then let us know your thoughts and opinions about this or really anything else we've talked about today.
Yeah, that's great. I like that idea because I oftentimes think our sort of IT people think that it's a huge demand when it's maybe not. And I kind of think a lot of the producers I know, and I get it. There's a lot of younger people like Gavin that come from the universities. They're tech savvy. They're on their phones a lot. But a lot of the producers I know, they can kind of do spreadsheets. They like spreadsheets. They grew up with them. But some things on the phone are great. Talking to your commodity broker or talking to your input suppliers, but checking the weather, checking what prices are, things like that, I think are very convenient on the phone. I don't know about all these phone-based calculators. So yeah, any input we could give would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jon, as we wrap up today, if there's one thing listeners take away from this conversation, what do you want that to be?
It's kind of my company line. If you have an interest, feel free to reach out. Like, it may sound complex, but I'm more than happy to sit down and help somebody go through these. I mean, we've got several of these sort of pretty simple to use calculators, but simple's a relative term, and it's not, I try to do these things where I could get my grandmother, where I could get my grandmother to sit down and do this, right? Otherwise, they get frustrated and they're like, well, I'm never going to use it. And if anybody has an interest, I'm more than happy to sit and go through it and kind of walk you through it and even do a demonstration. I think you'll find it's pretty simple, but everything new is not simple, and I get that. So always feel free to reach out. You can email me, you can call me, and we can find a time or a way where we can sit and go through it. And in any of our stuff that we're doing, I have that same message.
All right. Well, Jon, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Yeah. Well, folks, I will try to include as much information and links in the podcast description as possible, whether it was about the tool Jon and I discussed today, or even other resources that were mentioned, whether it be advertisers, etc. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who's going to find this information valuable, because podcasts still grow best by word of mouth. But with that, happy ranching, folks.